Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome once again to this quiet corner of history. If you're listening beneath a blanket, or letting the soft murmur of time ease you toward sleep, then you've come to the right place. Tonight, our journey carries us back not to the dark centuries of medieval Europe, but to a more familiar past, the winter of 1891. A time when steamships already crossed the Channel, gas lamps lined the streets of London, and the industrial age was in full voice. And yet, for all its modern progress, that winter would remind England and Wales that nature's strength still held dominion over man. The year had opened in silence and frost. By January, the fields of Cornwall lay stiff and white beneath a hard sky. Farmhands cracked the surface of frozen troughs each morning so that the animals could drink. In the ports, the air tasted of salt and iron, and even the gulls flew lower, their cries sharp against the bitter wind. It had been years since anyone remembered such a season, a winter that clung to the bones of the land and refused to release its hold. In the small villages scattered along the southwestern coast, people spoke in murmurs of strange weather. For weeks, the sea had been restless, tides running unusually high, and the western horizon often bruised with dark, swollen clouds. At night, fishermen's wives watched the lamps of trawlers vanish into the fog and prayed they would return with the dawn. Few suspected that the true danger still lay ahead, that by the first days of March, a storm unlike any in living memory would descend upon Britain with merciless force. The newspapers of the day spoke of cold statistics, barometric pressures, snowfall records, and wind speeds. But to those who lived it, the great blizzard of 1891 was not measured in inches or miles per hour. It was measured in the hours without warmth, the nights without light, and the long, hollow sound of wind tearing at the doors of wooden cottages. Imagine yourself there, standing on the Cornish cliffs in late February. The sea below is grey, its surface puckered and wild. The wind cuts through your coat like a blade. Somewhere inland, church bells toll faintly through the snow. A farmer leads his horse through the lane, both man and beast bent against the gale. The air smells of smoke, damp straw, and distant salt, the scent of a country bracing for what it cannot yet see. By the second day of March, the first warnings reached the western coasts. Telegraph operators along the Bristol Channel reported plummeting pressure. At sea, captains described sudden squalls and walls of mist rolling in from the Atlantic. The Royal Meteorological Office, still young in its science, issued only cautious advisories, heavy weather approaching. No one yet called it a blizzard. But by dawn of the next morning, snow was falling thick and fast across Devon and the Welsh hills. By midday, it would bury the land so deeply that even the railways would fall silent. As the storm gathered, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sky, once merely gray, turned to an oppressive white that blurred the horizon into nothingness. Snow came not as gentle flakes, but as a ceaseless torrent driven by a wind so fierce it stripped thatch from rooftops and snapped telegraph wires like threads. In Plymouth, the harbor lights vanished by noon. By evening, the roads had disappeared beneath drifts taller than a man. And yet, as the storm raged, life went on, in flickering lamplight and quiet determination. Families huddled by hearths that burned low, rationing coal and bread. In coastal inns, travelers stranded by the weather shared stories, passing the hours as panes of frost thickened upon the glass. Church bells, muffled by snow, marked the passing of each hour like distant heartbeats. No one knew how long it would last. But in the dim glow of those nights, as winds howled across the moors and waves shattered against the cliffs, one truth became clear, that for all the power of invention and industry, humanity still knelt before the oldest of forces, the storm. This was the beginning of the great blizzard of 1891. And in the chapters to come, we will walk beside those who faced it, the sailors, the farmers, the children and rescuers, whose courage and sorrow would become part of England's frozen memory. Close your eyes now, listen to the soft rise of the wind in your imagination. The year is 1891. The snow has begun to fall. By the dawn of March 3, 1891, the storm had crossed the western seas. It arrived without thunder, without lightning, only the unbroken voice of the wind, howling like something ancient and alive. From Cornwall to the Welsh coast, the world disappeared beneath white. Villages woke to silence so complete that even the crows were gone. In the market town of Launceston, snowdrifts rose halfway up the church windows. Men with shovels cleared paths no sooner than they vanished again. Carts overturned, their wheels locked in ice. Horses stood motionless, their breath pluming into mist. And in the harbor towns, the sound of the sea was replaced by something darker, the creak of frozen rigging, the dull crack of timbers under strain. Out in the channel, ships fought desperately against the gale. The schooner Bay of Panama, laden with coal, was last seen near the Cornish coast, its sails torn to ribbons. Flares were spotted in the night, faint sparks swallowed by the snow. Rescue crews tried to launch lifeboats, but the waves broke them before they left the shore. By morning, wreckage washed upon the sands, barrels, rope, and shattered planks glistening with frost. For those inland, the sea's tragedy was only whispered, carried by rumor. Their own battle was with the cold. Farmsteads vanished under mounds of snow, doors could not be opened, roofs groaned under the weight. In cottages near Dartmoor, families tunneled passages through the drifts to reach their neighbors. Cattle perished in barns, suffocated as snow sealed every vent. Men took turns through the night breaking ice in the wells so that the water would not vanish entirely. Across the moors, the wind never rested. It hissed through cracks in stone walls, it rattled window panes until nails came loose. The landscape itself seemed erased, roads gone, hedgerows invisible, familiar landmarks buried beyond recognition. Only the church steeples and the black lines of telegraph poles stood above the white expanse, like skeletons of a world still trying to speak. In Plymouth, the telegraph office fell silent by midday. The last message sent from the west read only, snow, wind increasing, no traffic possible. Then the line went dead. Trains bound for Exeter froze on the tracks, passengers huddled together in dimly lit carriages, listening to the moan of iron expanding in the cold. One account told of a porter walking miles through waist-deep drifts to carry word to the next station, his eyelashes frozen solid, his hands raw and bleeding by the time he arrived. And still the storm grew stronger. For 2 nights and 3 days it ravaged the land without pause. Winds reached nearly 80 miles an hour along the Cornish cliffs. Entire flocks of sheep vanished into the white, their bodies later found buried beneath 5 feet of snow. Fishermen who had gone out before the first gusts now never returned, their families lit candles that burned low in the windows, small flickers of hope swallowed by the storm. There were no grand rescues that week, no triumphs. Only endurance, and silence. When the wind finally began to fade, it left behind a landscape transformed into something unearthly. Hedges were gone, chimneys toppled, and fields once green now stretched as smooth and pale as marble. Travelers spoke of entire trains buried, of horses frozen mid-stride, their harnesses encased in ice. In many towns, the church bells rang not for service, but for the dead. And yet, amidst that stillness, small acts of kindness glimmered like embers. Neighbors breaking bread with those who had none. A farmer giving his last candle to an elderly widow whose fire had gone out. In Tavistock, a schoolteacher took in 3 stranded children who had lost their way in the snow. For 2 days, she kept them alive with nothing but thin soup and stories told by lamplight. When the sun returned at last, it shone over a country wounded but unbroken. Icicles dripped from eaves, the sound of water faint but hopeful. The snow began to collapse in heavy sheets from rooftops, revealing the color of the world once more, gray stone, brown fields, and the green of pine beneath the thaw. The great blizzard had passed, but its memory, like a scar, would linger through the years. They called it the Storm of Storms. And in the quiet that followed, people across England and Wales began to count the cost: 200 lives lost, hundreds of homes destroyed, and a coastline forever reshaped by the sea's fury. But they also counted the living, the saved, and the stories told by Hearthlight, of courage, of loss, and of the fragile thread that binds humanity against the vastness of nature. And so, as night fell again over the thawing fields, the people of that long winter learned what every generation must. That even in the face of cold, despair, and the silence of the storm, the heart of endurance beats quietly on. The sea remembers. Long after the wind has fallen silent and the last snow has melted from the fields, the sea keeps its own account of tragedy. Along the coasts of Cornwall and Wales, where cliffs meet the Atlantic's gray horizon, the Great Blizzard of 1891 left not only fields buried in white, but hundreds of miles of shattered shore. In the days following the storm, the beaches were littered with wreckage. Planks, casks, and broken spars lay tangled in seaweed and ice. The salt wind carried the faint smell of tar and oak, mingled with the cold scent of loss. From Penzance to the Lizard Peninsula, the same grim story repeated itself: ships driven aground, crews swept overboard, lifeboats smashed to splinters before they ever touched the water. At Coverack, a quiet fishing village clinging to the Cornish coast, the people awoke to a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Just beyond the surf, the great steamer Bay of Panama lay heeled over, her black hull breaking apart against the rocks. The storm had struck her in the night. She had fought the wind for hours before being dragged, helpless, onto the jagged stones known to sailors as the Manacles, a graveyard of ships even in fair weather. The villagers rushed to the cliffs, their boots sinking into snow as they peered down through the mist. They could see the outlines of men clinging to the tilted deck, waves crashing over them in blinding spray. Each time the sea withdrew, the cries came faintly, carried up the rocks and across the frozen fields. But no one could reach them. Every rope tossed down was snatched away by the gale. The lifeboat from nearby Porthouse Dock was launched twice and overturned twice before it ever cleared the harbor mouth. Through the long gray morning, the villagers could only watch as the Bay of Panama broke apart. One by one, the masts collapsed into the surf. By midday, only fragments remained: a section of hull, a single lifeboat washed ashore with 2 men inside, both frozen where they sat. When the tide receded, it left behind a shoreline strewn with barrels, crates, and the bodies of 20 men. A few days later, when the sea softened, more were found along the coves, faces pale, hands still curled as if clutching invisible ropes. The tragedy of the Bay of Panama was not alone. That same week, the schooner Volunteer vanished off the Pembrokeshire coast, the Tregothnan ran aground near the Isles of Scilly, and a dozen smaller boats were lost without a trace. In total, over 200 sailors were believed to have perished between March 3 and March 7, more than any single winter storm in the century before. For the people of the coast, grief came mingled with duty. Men and women alike joined the search along the tidalines, hauling what they could from the wrecks. They built fires on the sand to thaw the frozen bodies enough to recognize them, wrapping the dead in sailcloth and carrying them to the churchyards above the cliffs. One vicar wrote in his parish ledger, "We have buried more in these 2 days than in the past 2 years." But not every story ended in sorrow. Near Falmouth, a group of fishermen discovered 3 survivors from a wrecked brig, half buried in snow beneath an overturned lifeboat. They had gone 4 days without food, their hands blackened with frostbite. Carried to a nearby cottage, they were given broth, bandages, and blankets before dawn. 2 recovered. The third, they said, smiled once, whispered a name, and slipped quietly away. In London, newspapers told these stories with reverent astonishment. Illustrated sketches showed lifeboats battling monstrous waves and women kneeling in the snow beside the drowned. The headlines called it the White Calamity. Charities raised funds for the widows of seamen. In Parliament, there were speeches about better weather warnings and stronger coastal defences. But for those who had watched the sea claim their kin, no words or coin could thaw the memory of that week. When spring finally arrived, it brought with it an eerie stillness. The sea turned calm again, glassy beneath the pale March sun. Children wandered the beaches, collecting bits of driftwood and glass polished smooth by the waves. The wreck of the Bay of Panama was still visible at low tide, its rusted bones jutting through the foam like a monument to the sea's indifference. And yet, life returned. By April, the first fishing boats dared to venture out again. Sails rose along the horizon, gulls followed in their wake, and the scent of salt fish once more drifted across the harbors. But each crew, before setting sail, looked once toward the west, toward the gray line where sea met sky, and whispered a silent prayer. For they knew that the ocean had a memory longer than man's, and that one day, when all seemed calm again, it might remember them too. When the blizzard at last withdrew from the coast, it did not vanish altogether. It simply drifted inland, across the moors and valleys of Devon, over the hedgerows of Somerset, and into the Welsh hills. What it left behind was not a single moment of disaster, like the shipwrecks at sea, but a long, slow silence, a stillness that stretched from one horizon to the next. In those inland villages, time itself seemed to pause. The usual sounds of life, the clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the bark of dogs, the toll of the blacksmith's hammer, were gone. Instead, the air was filled only with the soft whisper of snow sliding from roofs, the distant crack of ice splitting on frozen ponds, and the faint moan of wind moving through bare trees. At dawn, the cottages were like tombs. Windows rimed with frost, doors frozen shut from the inside. To leave one's home meant digging through drifts taller than the fences. Children woke beneath blankets stiff with ice, their breath misting in the cold air, while mothers stoked faint embers in the hearth with gloved hands already numb. A good fire had become a form of wealth, and every stick of dry wood was guarded as though it were gold. In one hamlet near Exmoor, a farmer named William Cobb recorded in his diary, "The cattle are lost in the barn. I hear them but cannot reach them. I pray the snow will lighten soon." It did not. For days the barns remained sealed, roofs sagging under the weight of ice. When rescue finally came, the air was filled with a heavy, still sadness, the kind that no words can ease. For many, livestock were their only means of survival. When the animals died, hunger soon followed. Bread ran out first, then coal. In some homes, families burned furniture to stay alive, broken chairs, fence posts, even wooden crates once used to store apples from the autumn harvest. In Cardiff and Swansea, soup kitchens were opened by the churches, their thin broth shared among hundreds each day. The line for food stretched around corners, through alleys where snow turned to slush under the boots of the desperate. There were no beggars that winter, only survivors waiting their turn. Yet, in the midst of that hardship, humanity did not wither. In a village near Bridgewater, the church bell that had been silent through the storm rang again, not for a funeral, but to summon the people to help one another. The young men set out with spades and shovels, digging paths between cottages so that the elderly could receive food. Women took turns baking what little flour they had into loaves for those who had none. And at night, when the sky cleared at last, they gathered in the chapel by candlelight, singing old hymns that trembled in the cold air. It was said that during those nights, when the world lay buried in white, even the stars seemed closer, their light sharp and clear, reflecting off the snow like scattered silver. Some claimed they could hear the faint ringing of the sea's frozen edge miles away, a low hum that came and went with the wind. Others spoke of strange, beautiful silence, the kind that fills not with fear, but with awe. For in that silence, there was something ancient, something humbling, a reminder that man and nature were not enemies, but two frail forces sharing the same earth. When the first thaw began, it came quietly. A steady drip from the eaves. A rivulet winding its way down a frozen path. Children, who had not played outdoors in weeks, stood by their doors and listened to the sound of water, a sound more precious than any song. The air softened. The color returned to the land. And with it, the people began to move again, sweeping out snow from their doorways, mending fences, counting what had been lost. In London, the newspapers carried stories from the countryside, entire parishes cut off, mail coach buried for 3 days, villagers saved by candlelight. But for the people who had lived it, there was no headline that could capture what they had endured. The blizzard had tested them not with sudden violence, but with slow, relentless endurance. And in surviving it, they discovered a quiet truth, that even the smallest flame, shared and protected, can outlast the longest night. When spring finally came to Devon, the rivers ran fast and clear again. The fields, once frozen and white, shimmered with new shoots of green. And though the people returned to their daily labors, to plowing, to mending, to fishing, they did so with the memory of that winter lodged deep within them. It became not just a story of suffering, but a lesson carried forward through generations, that no machine, no invention, no progress of man could ever outmatch the raw patience of nature. That lesson would linger long after the snow melted, long after the last newspaper had been folded and forgotten. In the hearts of those who had lived through the frozen months of 1891, it remained a quiet truth, whispered in prayers, in songs, and in the steady rhythm of life reborn. By late March of 1891, the air had changed. The cutting edge of the wind softened, the snow along the hedgerows grew thin, and the rivers began to murmur once more. It was as though the land, after weeks of silence, had drawn a slow and trembling breath. The thaw came not as a single moment, but as a quiet transformation. The white crust of ice began to sag and fold upon itself, slipping from rooftops with a heavy sigh. Icicles dripped from church eaves, their drops echoing like metronomes in the stillness of morning. Along the moors, the first patches of earth appeared, dark, damp, and rich, like the surface of some newly awakened world. For those who had survived the long winter, the sight of bare soil was more than just a change of season, it was a kind of resurrection. Yet, as the snow retreated, it revealed what it had hidden. Collapsed barns. Dead livestock. The outlines of cottages whose chimneys no longer smoked. The thaw did not bring joy at once, it brought reckoning. In Cornwall, men returned to the cliffs to salvage what they could from the wrecked ships. Wood was gathered not for trade but for rebuilding homes. Along the coastal lanes, simple wooden crosses appeared, marking where the sea had taken its toll. The sound of hammering filled the air again, not the proud rhythm of industry, but the slow, steady beat of repair. Inland, fields once buried beneath 6 feet of snow were found ruined by frost. The seed for spring planting had frozen in its sacks, stored too close to unheated walls. Farmers shared what little they had left, bartering potatoes for coal, oats for candles. The markets of Bristol and Exeter overflowed not with goods, but with stories, each man recounting his losses, his narrow escapes, his small mercies. One spoke of digging a path to his neighbor's door by the light of a lantern. Another of finding a lost child alive beneath a drift, her small hands wrapped around a frozen loaf of bread. The newspapers continued their sober reports. 200 souls lost at sea. Entire villages snowbound. Relief efforts ongoing. But in the quiet of homes and hearths, people no longer spoke in numbers. They spoke instead of what had been endured, of the courage of lifeboat men who launched into impossible waves, of farmers who dug through snow to save strangers, of children who had waited through the night for fathers who never returned. In London, Parliament debated funding for coastal safety improvements. The Meteorological Office, embarrassed by its limited warning system, promised reforms. And yet, most understood that no signal, no telegraph, no forecast could ever have truly stopped what had come. Nature, in that winter, had not been cruel, only honest. It had reminded mankind of its limits, and in doing so, it had renewed a kind of humility long forgotten in the age of iron and steam. As April arrived, the landscape bloomed again. Crocuses pushed through the last crusts of snow. Streams carried the melted pastures down to the sea, where the tide rolled in gently, as though nothing had ever happened. But those who lived through the great blizzard could never forget the sound of that wind, the long, mournful howl that had seemed to rise from the very heart of the earth. In Coverack, where the Bay of Panama had met her end, spring brought pilgrims. Families of lost sailors came to stand upon the cliffs, gazing out toward the gray horizon. Some cast wreaths upon the water. Others stood in silence, their lips moving in prayer. And beneath the waves, the ship's broken bones rested quietly, covered in seaweed and silt, the last chapter of a storm that had written its story in snow and salt. Farther inland, life returned to its rhythm. Churches reopened, markets bustled, schoolyards rang with laughter again. But something in the people had changed. Their eyes, it was said, had learned a kind of patience. They no longer hurried against the seasons, no longer assumed that the works of man could stand above the will of the earth. They had seen how easily a single night could silence the engines of progress, and they had learned to listen once more, to the wind, to the sky, to the quiet warnings of the world itself. By the summer of 1891, the great blizzard was already becoming legend. But legends, as the English have always known, are not merely tales of heroism or loss. They are mirrors, ways of remembering who we are when the lights go out, when the fields freeze, when all that remains is the warmth we share with one another. And so the people remembered. Each year, when the first frost crept over the fields, old men would nod to the horizon and say softly, "It was like this once, in '91. And younger generations, listening, would imagine a land buried in white, a sea roaring in darkness, and a people who endured, not by strength alone, but by compassion. The blizzard had passed. The land was alive again. But in every hearth, in every story told beside the fire, its cold breath lingered still, a whisper from the past, reminding all who listened that even in the harshest winter, the heart of England kept its quiet flame. The years that followed the great blizzard of 1891 passed quietly, as years often do after calamity. Seasons turned, crops returned to the soil, and the sound of laughter once again drifted through the valleys of Devon and along the harbors of Cornwall. But beneath that quiet surface, the memory of the storm lingered, not in fear, but in reverence. In the fishing villages that had faced the full wrath of the Atlantic, every winter carried its rituals. When the first gale swept in from the sea, men checked the ropes twice, mended the nets more carefully, and spoke to the ocean in low voices, half jest and half prayer. No sailor in Coverack or Porthleven would cast off without glancing once at the horizon, that silent gray line where the blizzard had first been born. It was said that those who survived the storm could smell a change in the air long before a storm arrived, a faint metallic taste carried by the wind, a stillness that no barometer could measure. Inland, the lessons were quieter but no less deep. Communities that had once lived apart now stayed close. A farmer in Somerset shared his hay with the village next to his. In return, they brought flour when his crop failed. People had learned that survival was not a solitary art, but a shared one. The blizzard had taught them that the warmth of a single hearth could become the heart of an entire village. And yet, as the decades passed, the story began to change shape. Children born after the storm heard it not as fact, but as legend. They were told of nights when the snow buried entire towns, when the sea rose in anger, when ships shattered like glass beneath the waves. Old men spoke of it by candlelight, their words softened by time. Ah yes, the blizzard of '91, the winter when even the sea froze. The children would listen, eyes wide, imagining a world of white silence and flickering lamps, of courage carved in frost. They did not need to know every detail, the essence of the tale was enough. For in the telling, the blizzard became something larger than the storm itself. It became a parable, a story of endurance, of humility before nature, of the strange beauty found even in hardship. It reminded those who heard it that civilization, for all its progress, still depended on the simple rhythm of weather, on the mercy of the earth beneath their feet. When the 20th century dawned, bringing electricity, motor cars, and the roar of factories, the blizzard seemed to belong to another age. But nature remembered. And every few years, when snow fell heavy and winds howled down from the Atlantic, old newspapers would reprint those faded reports. The Great Blizzard of 1891, England's frozen tragedy. The younger generation would read them with curiosity, marveling at the courage of their ancestors. And in the quiet moments between storms, they might look out the window and feel, for just an instant, that same ancient stillness, that same fragile connection to a world larger than themselves. In time, the blizzard joined the long gallery of Britain's remembered storms, alongside the floods of '72, the gales of the Channel, the fires of London. But those who lived near the Western Sea still spoke of it differently. They said it was not merely a storm, but a visitation. A reminder that the earth, though tamed by industry, remained alive, and that its breath could still humble kings and peasants alike. Today, if you walk the Cornish coast in winter, when the wind rises and the gulls vanish inland, you can still feel its presence. The cliffs stand dark against the foam, the sea churns with the same restless rhythm, and the cottages huddle close as though remembering. Sometimes, when snow begins to fall and the world turns white once more, you might hear the faint echo of that long-ago wind, not in sound, but in the hush that follows it. And if you listen closely, you might also hear something else. The quiet resilience of those who came before you. The whisper of hands that built fires in the cold, of voices that sang hymns beneath the weight of snow, of hearts that refused to surrender even when the world turned to ice. That, more than any monument or stone, is the legacy of the Great Blizzard of 1891. A legacy written not in books, but in the rhythm of life that continues, in the trust between neighbors, in the calm respect for the sea, in the soft gratitude felt each time spring returns. For though the storm is gone, its lesson remains. That warmth is not found in weather, but in one another. That courage is not in defiance, but in endurance. And that even in the darkest, coldest night, there is always a light, small, steady, and human, waiting to be kept. So rest easy now, traveler. The storm has passed. The fires are burning once again. And beyond your window, somewhere far away, the wind carries only the faintest memory of snow. And now, as our long winter tale draws to a close, let the echoes fade. The snow that once buried the fields has melted into rivers that still run through England's heart. The cliffs that faced the storm stand silent now, watching the same grey sea that has always breathed against their feet. Time has smoothed the edges of that memory, yet it remains, like frost that lingers in the shade long after morning has come. More than a century has passed since the great blizzard of 1891. The ships that braved it have rotted into sand, their names half erased by tide and time. The villages that once fought to stay warm have become quiet towns, their chimneys rising against skies lit by electric light instead of oil lamps. And yet, in some quiet way, the blizzard never truly ended. It lives on, in the patience of those who mend what is broken, in the calm courage that surfaces when the world grows uncertain once again. For every generation faces its own kind of winter. Sometimes it comes as snow and wind. Sometimes it comes as hardship, or silence, or loss. And though the shapes may change, the lesson remains the same. That human warmth, fragile, ordinary, enduring, is the one fire that never goes out. When the people of that frozen year rebuilt their homes, they did not boast of survival. They simply carried on, lighting candles, mending fences, planting seeds. Each small act of living became an act of faith. And it is that quiet faith, more than the storm itself, that history remembers. So, as you rest now, let their story settle like gentle snow upon your thoughts. Let the rhythm of their endurance steady your own heart. And if the world beyond your walls feels cold tonight, remember. You are not alone in the dark. You are part of a long, unbroken line of souls who endured, who hoped, who kept the flame alive. The blizzard is long gone. The land is warm again. But its whisper remains, a promise, soft and true. That after every storm, there is calm. After every night, there is dawn. And after every winter, no matter how cruel, spring always comes.